Among all the servants, none are so flat as Assassin. This was likely an intentional decision. The servant with whom Assassin's master was meant to bond the strongest to was someone else, and as a result, Assassin itself was just a placeholder, a device to give certain characters eyes to see various scenes, to communicate with one another, to plot, and ultimately to be thrown on the sacrificial altar to showcase the power of a rival. While Assassin may have been a flat character used primarily as a narrative device, its master, Kirei Kotomine, more than makes up for the lack, having one of the most robust arcs of all the characters in the story. Prior to his encounter with Gilgamesh, Kirei was a character who could almost be called an embodiment of nihilism. He possessed neither passion nor love, and went through the motions of life out of nothing but a sense of obligation to his family and social circle. He attempted to fill the role of a husband despite having no love for his wife, to fill the role of a dutiful son and member of the clergy, despite having no love for his father, nor any ability to comprehend his father's ideals of beauty or goodness, and finally to fill the role of the model student, once his father and Tokiomi began plotting his use as an accomplice in the Holy Grail War. Kirei Kotomine is another character I find to be deeply relatable. Perhaps it's a side effect of living in the modern age, where now more than ever we have a full grasp on how massive the world is and how minuscule and insignificant a part of it we are. But nihilism and a lack of ambition can be an ever-present part of life growing up. To that extent, even though my knowledge of Fate Stay Night already told me the endgame, I found myself rooting for Kirei during his initial few scenes, having heart enough to hope that he could find an answer that would bring him true desire, and escape from the prison of despair and nihilism that he had been so thoroughly trapped in. He initially believed that the secret to this was hidden in Kiritsugu Emiya, whose actions led him to believe that he was a kindred spirit, a similarly empty individual going through the motions of life despite lacking the spark of humanity. In truth, I feel he had much more in common with Waver than Kiritsugu, with the sole difference being that Waver was a bit more self-driven. Both Waver and Kirei were characters performing actions they didn't truly desire for the sake of fulfilling a role in society to which they felt they belonged, and both overcame their doldrums and began to walk paths of personal fulfillment thanks to the relationship they developed with a servant. While Kirei's awakening ultimately led to disaster for others, and for the world he inhabited, if you divorce his character arc from his character itself, you can actually argue that Kirei's story is an uplifting one, about overcoming nihilism and finding your own happiness in the world. But I'll discuss the other half of Kirei's character a little later on. At the time of initial summoning, Team Archer was the favorite to win the Holy Grail War. The combination of the most ancient and powerful hero in human history, with the unflappable, charismatic head of one of the three great houses of magecraft, made for what seemed to be an invincible duo. And indeed, had they remained allies throughout the war, it may well have had a very different conclusion. Sadly, the cracks in their relationship make themselves clear almost as soon as we see them interact, and their partnership ultimately ends in disaster. Let's begin with Tokiomi, a character who seemed custom-made to be the archetype of the idealized member of the Mages Association. He's a man who stresses elegance in all things, never showing his emotion or allowing anything he encounters to outwardly faze him. The general word about him I hear in the fandom is that he's boring, and somewhat underwhelming for being the man who was the father to fan favorite Rin Tosaka. I don't entirely disagree, but his status as the archetypal mage actually made him pretty eye-opening for me as a window into the Magus mindset and the values of their society. A good example of this is during his fight with Karia. Over the course of that battle, he, at 2 points in their shouting, praises his wife for being good breeding stock, and responds with excitement at the prospect of his daughters one day fighting one another. To an ordinary person, either of these would be pretty terrible and dehumanizing, since he seems to value a person's contribution to the generations to come far more than that person as an individual. But we know due to his role as a window into the Magus society, that such crass, distant ways of thinking are par for the course and lauded within his society. His relationship with his servant is definitely an interesting one too, with him willingly taking a subservient role before the King of Heroes, creating a dynamic we don't really see much of in the Fate franchise, outside of perhaps the likes of Darnik and Vlad from Fate Apocrypha. When addressing his servant, he frequently bows, choosing his words humbly and doing all that he can to placate Gilgamesh's ego, an undertaking I most assuredly don't envy. All of this belies the fact that he ultimately views Archer as a familiar, and is biding his time until the day the Grail manifests, after which he plans to use his command seals to compel Gilgamesh to kill himself, since he needs the mana from all 7 of the summoned servants in order to open the path to the root. And there was one other thing I will say I found interesting about Tokiomi, something that really drove home for me that he was, in fact, Rin Tosaka's role model: the way he died. His death was an act of betrayal, sudden and painful, but it was also one of the few moments of honesty we ever see from him. He had not predicted Kirei's betrayal. In his eyes, Kirei Kotomine trying to kill him was an impossibility, and because of this, the instant that dagger slipped into his heart, his facade of being a perfect mage cracked away, and we saw a glimpse of his true self. What did I see in that glimpse? Well, as I implied a second ago, I don't think Tokiomi was quite the model mage he pretended to be. A proper mage would keep the rest of the world at a distance. A proper mage student would look for any chance to overcome his master, doubly so if they were both participating in a war with only one victor. Yet Tokiomi harbored not the slightest suspicion of his student. Tokiomi loved and trusted the people he accepted into his personal circle. Much like his daughter, he had a hard shell of cold professionalism, but contained within it a genuinely loving and trusting heart. It was this warmth and humanity that ultimately made him vulnerable, but also served to make his death all the more tragic. Fortunately, his daughter would choose her friends a little better. I'm going to discuss Gilgamesh more a little later on, but I did want to talk about his relationship with Tokiomi specifically while I'm here. He makes his decision that Tokiomi is a boring man fairly early on in the series, regarding him as a small man with small dreams. In spite of this, he did occasionally display respect toward Tokiomi for fulfilling his duties as his retainer. During the battle with Castor, he eventually allowed Tokiomi's pleading to drive him to attack Castor's monster, and while he confessed to Kirei that he despised command seals, he was able to rationalize their use, stating that if a retainer were to use one to try to show his king an alternative way of approaching their goals, then he could bring himself to abide them. It gradually became clear that he was grooming Kirei to kill Tokiomi, but he hesitated to speak this out loud, in part because watching Kirei come to realize his desire would amuse him, but also because he felt conflicted in betraying the loyalty Tokiomi had displayed as his retainer. And ultimately, he only fully embraced his betrayal of the Magus after Kirei revealed Tokiomi's plans to open up the route upon the Grail War's end. He was a king who had some degree of sympathy for a retainer who knew his place, but lost no sleep about ridding himself of the dull burden the moment he discovered his betrayal. Kiritsugu Emiya is a man with the tactics and disposition of a cynic, but the ultimate dream of a naive young man. From the start, he freely confesses that his dream of a world devoid of conflict, where no child ever needs to cry, is vague and impossible, the kind of thing that only an omnipotent wish could possibly hope to grant. Even though he knows this, and even though he doesn't truly understand the nature of the Holy Grail, he commits to his plan absolutely, prepared to commit any number of atrocities to see his dream come true. Kiritsugu's story is a classic Greek tragedy, a man of tremendous vision who is undone by his hubris and suffers intense remorse when the scope of his actions are finally understood. He's the closest thing to a central character the narrative of Fate Zero has, and as a result we see more of what makes him tick than any other master, with only Kirei rivaling his exposure. The thing I find the most interesting about him is the disconnect between his methods and his ideals, motivated by the kind of saccharine peace fantasy you'd expect from a shonen hero, despite the fact that he betrays, murders, and allows innocents to come to harm through inaction, all in order to see that fantasy come to fruition. Kotomine Kirei finds Kiritsugu fascinating because he looks over his body of work and comes to the conclusion that Kiritsugu must be as hollow and nihilistic as he is, but he's only half correct, if that. I think Kiritsugu had come to the brink of despair as a result of his profession and the reality of his sacrifice the minority to save the majority lifestyle. But the family he happened to create and the myth of the Holy Grail imbued him with an intense level of idealism, to the point where his ultimate goals almost make his adopted son Shiro seem more grounded by comparison, albeit he's far more pragmatic in bringing his goals to fruition. After his betrayal of Kainith, Saber posits the possibility that Kiritsugu had once dreamed of being a heroic spirit himself, arguing that the hatred he held toward them could only become so pure and strong if it had once been admiration and love. I'm inclined to agree with her assessment. With Kiritsugu, I see a man who hates war and conflict more than anyone else in the series. To this extent, he hates all heroic spirits as well, up to and including Saber. In his eyes, heroic spirits are simply figures that glorify and romanticize conflict, making the young dream of their chance to step out on the battlefield and live up to them. And it was this fledgling desire for battle that had led into so much of the strife and conflict he had spent so much of his life stepping into. To that end, he likely saw the Holy Grail War as an opportunity to use heroic spirits as instruments to undo the very system their existence helped to perpetuate. His downfall comes in the fact that he put his faith in the Holy Grail without truly understanding its nature. When he confronts the spirit of the Grail in the story's conclusion, even the Grail itself seems amused by his naivety, rejecting his wish for an idyllic world, and only willing to go so far as to give him the power to always choose who to save, trapping him in a never-ending cycle of sacrificing the few to save the many, watching as the number of people he had the power to protect endlessly dwindled and shrank. This resulted in his attempt to destroy the Grail, but even that didn't prevent the power of the device, which he had helped to summon, from overflowing and destroying Fuyuki City, adding the weight of all those lives lost in the incident onto his already heavy soul, to the point where he succumbed absolutely to remorse and despair. To make it to that point, he had sacrificed his wife, his access to his daughter, and his devoted friend. He had mercilessly slaughtered his rival masters in the war, and used his servant as a tool to his own ends. And it had all been for nothing. His tears of joy upon finding Shiro were sincere, and as much for himself as for the child. Shiro surviving the incident, there being one person who had survived what seemed to be an all-encompassing disaster, it represented a reason to keep living, a hope that there would be something he could find that would justify all the cost he had spent to live as long as he had. Compared to this story arc, Urusville and Maya are largely satellite characters, less interesting for their own characters than for the layers of Kiritsugu's character their presence allows the audience to witness. Urusville plays the role of Kiritsugu's shoulder angel. Her loving eyes provide context for his cruelty. Kiritsugu allows himself to be human around her, revealing his fears and insecurities. Deep down, his truest wish was a selfish one. He wanted to be a husband and a father. He wanted to take Urusville and Ilya far away and live the rest of his life in peace. At times, over the course of the war, this true wish would surface in his heart, and it would fall upon Irisviel to set him back on his path, correctly pointing out that he would never forgive himself if he'd left his war half-fought. Maya, in turn, would be Kiritsugu's shoulder devil. Her scenes with him show us his ruthless efficiency and pragmatism. She also represents his attempts to smother his more human side, both for the sake of carrying out his mission and for enduring the sorrow that came from setting events into motion that would result in the unavoidable death of his wife. At times they would be intimate, but it was never out of mutual love. Rather, it was playing out the role of a small betrayal of Irisviel, such that when the time came that he sacrificed her for his ambitions, the burden of that sacrifice would be even slightly easier to bear. This isn't for me to say their individual characters are bad, mind. I do really like their life stories, much like the sides of Kiritsugu they draw out. They are opposing, with Irisviel starting as a doll and discovering her humanity, whereas Maya started as a human and gradually converted herself into an emotionless doll. It's just that they were clearly written with intention of strengthening the audience's connection to Kiritsugu, and thus they wound up far more interesting to me in that capacity. This leaves only Saber, and Saber is the one character who appeared in both Fate Zero and Fate Stay Night to be truly handicapped by this story being a prequel. Kirei and Gilgamesh had the benefit of not being the central focus of the original Stay Night, and thus they had enough about their characters unexplored in that story for them to have meaningful arcs in Zero. Saber, though, couldn't change. Her self-loathing, her wish, we, as the audience, know that these things cannot change because they weren't resolved until the Fifth Holy Grail War. And this knowledge causes otherwise interesting story beats, like the meeting of kings and Iskandar's resolve to show her the folly of her way of thinking, to fall flat, because we already know that nothing can come of them. If I had to identify one good arc for her, it would be that she was a touch more idealistic in Fate Zero. It's clear that, between the death of Lancer, her encounter with Berserker, and Kiritsugu's betrayal, her faith and honor and her pride as a knight were substantially wounded before the Fourth Holy Grail War came to a conclusion. The story of the Fourth Holy Grail War is the story of Arturia becoming the somewhat bitter, somewhat broken knight that she would be when Shiro summoned her in the future. I figured I'd save this pair for last, since they were the puppet masters of most of the final act of the story. Kiritsugu may have had the most focus of all the masters, but Kirei had the strongest hand upon the narrative, beginning to direct the lives of the remaining masters and try to guide the war to its conclusion, basically as soon as he killed Tokiomi. The Kirei of the second half of the story couldn't be more different from the first. No longer is he passionless and mechanical in his actions, instead he begins acting with passion, eager to indulge in his newfound love of schadenfreude. I think my favorite thing about Kirei in the second half of Zero, as opposed to the first half, or his role in Stay Night, is that, while he's begun to embrace the darker half of his nature, he's still trying, at least on some level, to balance that darkness with the life he led before. He's accepted his flawed existence, that he's been born incapable of enjoying life unless he does so by observing the suffering of others. But he still holds out hope that he'll be proven wrong, or at the very least that his sadism will ultimately lead into some great event, either his being the vessel by which the Grail brings misery unto mankind, or his being the wicked final boss Kiritsugu would smite to save the world. It's important to note that I don't think Kotomine Kirei is a sociopath. He possesses some degree of empathy, and feels intense frustration and sorrow for his inability to love others and appreciate their ideals of joy and beauty. As a result of this, the very act of indulging his only source of joy causes him misery as well, although that's a character element that's only vaguely addressed within the confines of Zero, being more thoroughly addressed in the Heaven's Feel route of Stay Night. Within Zero, we see Kirei become somewhat high on his awakening, trying his hand at the role of chess master, which he would become quite skilled at by the events of the sequel series. The ambiguous end of the war, coupled with Kiritsugu being too emotionally devastated by the destruction of Fuyugi to play the role of the hero, left Kirei without all the answers he was craving, and gives him a personal motivation to move forward, spurred by a genuine desire to understand himself. As for the servant who awoke this fire within him, Gilgamesh is largely detached from the cast of Fate Zero. We do see him grow a type of respect for Ryder, the birth of his lust for Saber, and his strange, almost friendship with Kotomine Kirei. But on the whole, he regards the Holy Grail War and all the participants within it as little more than a momentary diversion, with his royal self much too far removed for their plight to directly impact him in any way. He was a member of the audience, like all of us, watching a tragedy unfold, except he had the power to change the script to better suit his tastes. In Fate Stay Night, Gilgamesh was primarily motivated by a genocidal hatred of modern human civilization, and a desire to see it rent asunder so that only the strong could survive. This trait is nowhere to be found in his Zero incarnation, however, either because that hatred was the result of his being exposed to the mana of Angra Mainyu, or because it developed gradually over the course of the decade he would spend as a human between the end of Zero and the start of Stay Night. This is relevant because, lacking that trait, I would hesitate to go so far as to call Gilgamesh a villain in Fate Zero. Granted, the morality of anyone else likely doesn't mean a lot to someone like Gilgamesh. His morality is centered entirely upon himself, with actions which please him being good, and those which bore him being evil. Rather than helping Kirei to become evil, his focus seemed to be on helping Kirei to be honest with himself. His favorite kinds of people were the ones who were self-driven, passionate, and internally consistent, after all. And if the person happened to be twisted and evil, then they would still have Gilgamesh's blessing, so long as they were passionate and honest in the pursuit of that evil. His aloof nature largely meant that he didn't allow the plot around him to influence his character enough for him to have an arc. Indeed, he was more of a force of nature in the plot than a character in his own right, the brick wall at the end of the road for others, the harsh reality that awaited at the end of their dream. Tragically, his character didn't even have a dearth of development in the original Stay Night to fall back on at the time the novels were originally published, and it wouldn't be until the game started spinning off that the King of Heroes would finally be given an arc for his fans to enjoy. Still, while he may not have been as deep or developed now as he would eventually grow to be, he was always entertaining, and his partnership with Kirei led to one of the most fascinating, if ultimately wicked, dynamics in the entire series. Fate Zero has a reputation for being a brutal, nihilistic show, and there is a pretty good reason for that. The Fourth Holy Grail War was a rigged game. Most of the people who fought in it were sabotaged beforehand by their own shortcomings, and most of the people who were allowed to walk away from the conflict happy were the kinds of people the audience wouldn't be able to enjoy seeing win in the end. That said, I don't think the story is completely bleak. Waver and Kirei are on opposite ends of the moral scale, but both of their stories are about self-actualization, about resisting the urge to lead life pursuing status and approval, or doing what you feel you're obliged to by your relationship to others, and instead embracing your own happiness, for good or ill. Hiritsugu's story is one of a man undone by his own ambition, and left broken by despair, but even his story has an upswing. Even when he hit rock bottom, he was able to see life struggling against death, and in nurturing that life, he found meaning again, allowing him to eventually die without completely losing hope. Tokiomi was betrayed and murdered, but the family line he valued infinitely more than his own life would continue, and his daughter Rain would continue his legacy with pride. Fate Zero tells a grim story, but it also shows just how strong the human spirit is, and I think, ultimately, the implication is that humans are stronger than the misfortune that befalls us. We can be greedy, and we tend to hold flaws that make us the architect of our own misfortune. But even if we're undone, even if we find ourselves at our lowest point, we're strong enough to find that one glimmer of hope, and use it to find happiness again.